The previous two speakers have made it difficult for me to follow their act, so I'll try my best and try and talk something about Ibn Arabi, perhaps the greatest Muslim Sufi that we know of. He is known as Shaykh al-Akbar, the great master, and he was born in Muslim Spain, and he lived there for over 30 years. He studied Islamic law, Islamic theology. He studied the recitations of the Quran. He studied poetry. He studied literature. You name it, whatever was available to him at that time, he studied. He then left and went on his travels, going down south to North Africa, where he was there in Tunisia, he was there in Libya, what is now Libya. It wasn't Libya then, and then also in Egypt. And in Egypt, he held a position of being a judge. Okay, so he's actually engaged with the world and the worldly affairs. And then he went on his journeys to the Arabian Peninsula, where he stayed for many years, especially in Mecca. And it is in Mecca that he wrote his famous work, the Meccan Revelations, or Al-Futuhat Al-Makkiyah, as they are called in Arabic. He stayed there, and then eventually he went towards the north into Syria, Damascus. He stayed in Damascus for a while, and it is there that he eventually passed and died. He's buried there, and many people still go and visit his grave. As Azam was talking about Muslims visiting graves, so his grave is very well frequented. The neighborhood in which he is buried is named after him. It's called the Hayy of Muhyiddin, the neighborhood of Muhyiddin, which is Ibn Arabi's first name. So this is a person who was prolific in his writing, extremely creative in his thinking, and quite frankly, outrageously audacious. He followed Ghazali in his methodology of Sufism. He sees Ghazali as his mentor. There's no doubt in that. In fact, there are narrations in which people say that he would have a copy of Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulum ad-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, in front of the Holy Kaaba while he was there in Mecca. And he would read that book in front of the Kaaba and then gain some insights and inspiration from there, and then he would start writing. So he does see Ghazali as a mentor, but whereas Ghazali was very calm, very calculated, and very in line with orthodoxy in his writing, Ibn Arabi, as I said, was audacious. He couldn't care less. He told the world what he experienced, and he wrote the way he felt. But what we need to do is we need to establish a backdrop to his life so that we understand where he's writing from. What is the context in which Ibn Arabi writes? So these are some of his works here, the Fusus. We'll read hopefully a passage from the Fusus, a translation by Michael Sells. So yeah, we'll read that passage. You'll see it's fascinating. So during that time, this is the medieval time, the heyday of Islamic theology. Muslims were ever engaged in theological issues from almost 40, 50 years after the Prophet's death. We engaged in theology and more than that, theism, the nature of God. Who is God? How is he? And how do we relate to God? This was a huge question in the Muslim civilization. And we had several groups representing their ideas and understandings of how the Quran, and then obviously the Hadith, the statements of the Prophet, how they depict and represent God. So this is a continuous tension and also a struggle for Muslim theologians. They all agree that God exists, and they all agree that the Quran is Allah's word, God's word, and they all agree that the Prophet is the Prophet. At that level, everything was monolithic. But when it came to understanding who God is, because they were preoccupied with the worship of God, and they wanted to know how best they could relate to God, it is because of that preoccupation that they dwelled into the whole theory of Godship and theism. We must appreciate that Muslims were extremely religious and pious. You hear stories about Muslims in the past and they were like this. But there was never an occasion in Muslim history where Muslims did not pray 5 times a day, and Muslims did not give zakat, and they didn't fast, and they didn't go for hajj. And that was all, it was like drinking water. That was second nature for them. What's more intriguing is the academic, intellectual pursuit of knowledge that they engaged in. So at this time, when Ibn Arabi came along, post-Ghazali, well, Ghazali was totally against the Muslim philosophers. The Muslim philosophers inherited a lot of the Greek philosophy and the Greek methodology of understanding the world and all of that, as you just heard. Okay? Then Ibn Arabi came, and he saw that this big tension is there, where certain groups believed that God is transcendent, that you can't reach God. God is beyond limits, and He's beyond words, and you cannot say anything about God. Yeah. So that was one group. The other group said, no, we have to ascribe whatever God ascribes to Himself, and we have to bring Him down to literally earth, and we have to assume that He almost has a human form. And then there are those in the middle who are still struggling with both ideas, where there's an apopathic method of understanding who God is, where there's negative theology where you negate everything, and you say God is not. He's not a body, He's not an atom, He's not a spirit, He has no dimension. So you understand God by negating everything that God is not. It's a negative theology. Then you have positive theology, where you say God is someone who hears and someone who listens, and God does rest or balance on His throne, and God does have a hand, and God does come down onto the first heaven in the wee hours of the morning, and so on. So there's positive theology and negative theology. Okay. So this was the tension. Ibn Arabi found a way to reconcile both of them, and his theory is based on the Quran itself. We must appreciate that Ibn Arabi was a literalist. Okay? His whole inspiration came from the Word of God. He saw everything in the Quran as being literal, and then he would use the etymology in order to substantiate most of his ideas. So he take a word, get to the etymology, the root, and then say that based on this, we see the Word of God is saying this. Okay. So he came down, and since the orthodoxy was more inclined towards transcendence and not so much towards immanence, he had some issues with people wherever he went. Obviously, he was a controversial figure to say the least. And he developed a system, I believe, of hermeneutics. Okay? I think this is his greatest contribution, but his hermeneutics is based on literalism, that it is the literal word of God That is the most important. So he does that in a very organized, systematic way. There are two things that he brings to the table. One is what you just heard, the ontology and the cosmology of how God comes down. That God is, first of all, up there somewhere. He is beyond reach, where there is no manifestation of his names and his attributes. And he is al-wujud al-mutlaq, he is the absolute existence, and he is in the ghayb al-mutlaq, where the absolute, what do you call it, an absence, right, al-ghayb. Then he comes down, then his names and attributes appear, and through his names and attributes, he then creates the world. Okay. But then he comes up with a fascinating theory, where we see that he includes the human being specifically, and the world in general, to be part of God's not only mission, but also his vision. So many people have many ideas about who Ibn Arabi was and was not, and so on. Some people say he's a pantheist, which is not true. Others say that he's a monist. Others say that he was trying to rectify the orthodoxy in this way, that way. But we would like to call him, for the sake of our presentation here today, we'll call him a non-dualist. That he didn't believe in dualism. He said that dualism is there as a paradox, and paradox is necessary for theism. So he says in one of his famous statements that al-uluhiyyatu taqtadi al-adlad, that Godship requires that there are opposites. So there are divine names that are contradictory to each other. So on one side, he will say he is a zahir, meaning the apparent. On the other side, he say he's the batin, meaning the inner. So these are opposites. And he says that the divine requires paradoxical opposites in order to perform. This is very important. So when we appreciate that the Quran says this also, and he is the first and he is also the last, al-awwal wal-akhir. So he goes into this understanding that the Quran is comprehensive and it has to be studied holistically in such a way that you incorporate every word that God says about himself, and you place it appropriately in God and also in existence. So it's like, you had pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So he saw that theologians had maybe 60% of the jigsaw puzzle pieces, and others had 20%, and others had 20%. So he wanted to bring all the jigsaw puzzle pieces together and then give this whole picture of who God actually is. For that, he had to become a non-dualist. That there is something called eminence, and there's something called transcendence, and he is everything. He is everything. And this is where, obviously, he got into trouble, where certain theologians in the Muslim community saw this heresy, this blasphemous. But he wasn't saying, because he was preceded by Abu Hanifa and Tahawi in most of his statements. This was in the earlier Muslim era, after the Prophet Muhammad. Abu Hanifa being very close to the time of the Prophet, and Tahawi, who came much later. But he also mentioned in his book on theology that he is both. That there is something called tanzih, the principle of tanzih, which is to remove any similarity with God. And there's the principle of tashbih, which is to associate God with everything God has associated himself with. So you will say in tanzih that there's nothing comparable to him. And you will say in tashbih that lahu yadun, he has a hand. So we will establish both the tanzih part, which is to remove similarities from God, and the tashbih part, which is to say whatever God says about himself, we will also establish and appreciate and believe in. So he combined both But this is, as I said, it was preceded by other theologians before him. What he did was that he put it into a language that was based on hermeneutics, and he put it into a case where you can say now that if a person who wants to worship God, he knows how to access him. So he will access him through the process of tashbih, where if he does find himself in front of God's throne, he won't negate it. Or if he finds himself that God's hand or God's finger is somewhere around him, he won't negate it. He will affirm it. And likewise, when he reaches that place where Dr. Marcia was saying about Hira, bewilderment, where you don't know who he is, you're just bewildered and in a state of ecstasy, and that's the state that every Sufi longs for. That I want to be in that state of ecstasy where I don't know who I am, where I am. Total ecstasy, right? Where you're beyond union with the beloved. That maqam or station of bewilderment is the objective of every Sufi. So if you go there, then you realize through this format and formula of hermeneutics and also theology that you will say, I know where I am. Okay? So he constructed this primarily, I think, from my readings. I've been reading Ibn Arabi for 40 years. Okay? In my reading of Ibn Arabi, I think he promoted this just for the Sufi, just for the Salik. I don't think he had too much interest in trying to appease the theologians because he didn't care for them. Okay? But he did want the Salik, the one who is traveling towards God, to experience God holistically and comprehensively, and for that he used the language which became very, very technical. One of his students, who came later on, Abdul Karim Jili, he has a whole index of Ibn Arabi's terminologies. He wrote a whole index that these are the terminologies that Ibn Arabi uses, and this word means this, and this word means. He compiled a totally different language for the Sufi, for the Sadiq. So this is what he did based on his incredible ability with words and his incredible understanding of the wahi, revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad. And this is his contribution to, I think, the Muslim world, where his influence is throughout the Muslim world, geographically. His influence, people talk about the Shias, he's influenced the Shia thinking of philosophy and mysticism. He's influenced the subcontinent in such a great way that we speak in terms of Akbarian. He's called the Shaykh Akbar. So in Akbarian thought is throughout India and Pakistan, in our culture, we would use his terminologies and language sometimes to even express ourselves. Until recently. Yeah. The Turks loved him. The Turks, the Ottoman Turks, made him their patron saint, Ibn Arabi. And then the people obviously in North Africa, they loved him also. So I'm saying is that this person came up with a language to define Sufi and mystic experience in such a way that he was so successful, everybody followed him. So that's why perhaps he's called the great master, Shaykh al-Akbar. Okay. Yeah. So now we go into how God actually creates. Okay. So the first process he acknowledges is the process of love. It is based on a statement by the Prophet Muhammad in which he says that God says, I was a hidden treasure. كُنْتُ كَنْزًا مَخْفِيًّا. I was a hidden treasure. And I love the idea of creating. So then I created. So Ibn Arabi uses that phrase to say that I loved, that this shows that the divine loves. And when he creates out of love. You know? It's not out of anger. It's not even out of compassion. It's out of pure love. He is a supreme creator. And because he loves to create, he creates. So he creates what? Everything. He creates what? Everything. Good and bad, good and evil, the devil, the Antichrist, Muhammad, Adam. He creates everybody and everything because he simply loves to create. So his creation is out of pure love. And I think this is very significant, obviously, in today's world, where you want to make sense of, many people have questions about God and why does God create evil, and is this God that he's going to allow people to suffer and do all this and that. Okay? So I think Ibn Arabi realized that once you understand that the being who is a creator is always going to create no matter what. So he creates purely out of love. This is the first fard, if you want to call it that, in Sufi terminology, the first descension, immanence from God, that he comes out from this hidden treasure and he brings out love. So on the negative film of love, he creates. If you understand that terminology. You'd heard of the Kodak, where you used to have a negative film and then you'd have a picture. So this is the negative film. Love is the negative film upon which God creates. This is fascinating. And he was the first person who said that this is how we must see God, because the hadith, the statement of the Prophet, existed in the community for many years. But nobody really brought it out the way Ibn Arabi brought it out. So then he says love then comes down all the way to the earth, and then it goes back up, as God always takes everything back to where it came from. And then he then formulates a system of mercy, of rahmah, which he says the most common form of mercy is that everything exists. His mercy is everywhere and for everyone, and the mere fact that something is brought into existence is a testimony to God's mercy. And from there he develops his theory of the grades of mercy all the way from the bottom to the top. We don't have time to get into that, but there you go. The lowest grade being existence itself. This is also fascinating because we are always struggling with this idea of who God is and what he does, and etc. The second point which I want to raise today is that Ibn Arabi emphasizes, as I said, on the literal meaning and the word of revelation, and he believes that every word is chosen for a reason. So he brings out this idea of femininity, not only in creation, but also in the creator. Okay? But obviously, he doesn't believe that the creator is either male or female. Muslims already determined that God has no gender. Okay? But he brings out this idea that in the social structure of the Muslim community, we must appreciate that God uses feminine terms to describe himself. Yeah? And feminine terms for creativity and everything else. Like for instance, the word nafs, which you heard of, right? You heard of the word nafs in the previous two presentations. Yeah, the soul, the self, the ego, whatever. So he says the word nafs is feminine in Arabic. And God says that he created you from one nafs. And that first nafs would be Adam. So he's saying that there's an element of femininity in the first nafs from which everyone was created, and that would be Adam. So in Adam there is femininity. Yeah. He comes up with these conclusions, just based on the etymology or the literal word that the Quran reveals, which gives us a sense that he really wanted the community to understand the Quran holistically and comprehensively, so that every aspect of the word was appropriated and understood. Okay. The second is that the word that we use to describe Allah himself, the that being the essence, that too is feminine. That's how we describe in Arabic, when we say the essence of God, we say Dhatullah. The Dhat of Allah, his essence, his self, his being. That in Arabic is feminine. So he says that when you have the essence being feminine, and the first being who gave birth or created another human being, that's also feminine, then you see that the emphasis in the Arabic language is that we must appreciate femininity in the cosmos. And to that he makes a brilliant deduction, superb deduction, that the Prophet Muhammad said that women have been made dear to me. Women have been made dear to me. Hubbiba ilayya nisa, which he talks about in his fusus, in the last fusus. So he says that Ibn Arabi, rahimahullah, wanted to bring out that the social ethos of the Muslim people must be that they see men and women as being representative of God's love. Representative of God's love. And he sees that in the Prophet, and he sees that in the early Muslim community. So this is the last statement there. You can read it. See it. So we know now today that when Muslim theologians thought, as Ibn Arabi, if you want to call him a theologian, which we don't, we call him a Sufi, he's gone beyond philosophy, okay? That they really understood the purpose of creation was that human beings must be able to worship the Creator in a very holistic and a comprehensive way. Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, that his conclusion is very clear, that God in his essence is beyond and he is transcendent. But God in his creation, he is immanent, and he comes down and he sees everything through his creation. So God sees creation through the creation. Okay. And this is the way the Sufi will experience God and eventually become part of God. But we must also appreciate that never does Ibn Arabi say that God becomes human or human becomes God. He negates that in Fusus. Al-abdu abdun wa in ala wa rabbu rabbun wa in nazal. That the servant will always remain a servant no matter how high he ascends. And the Lord will always remain the Lord no matter how low he comes down. He separates the two, okay? Meaning there's a creator and this creation. The link between them is of creativity. Okay? That's the only link. And it is with that link that you worship him, and eventually you get to him, and that's how he will show you his divine favor. Okay? We do have to appreciate that. But in the passage that we're about to read, you will see that there's some other gems that we see how Ibn Arabi in his works has shown the Sufi Salik, the traveler, how to reach God. And I think we have that. Yeah. This is from Fusus. I think it's the first chapter. The translation actually very good, very much in tune with the Arabic. We'll go through some of the lines here. When the real willed, from the perspective of its most beautiful name, which are countless, to see their determinations, or you could say when it will to see its own determination in a comprehensive being. So here he's talking about God's intent to create Adam, okay, who's his deputy on earth. So the name of the book is Fusus al-Hikam, is the ring settings of wisdom, where he sees the ring settings are the souls of the prophets, that the souls of the prophet bear the divine intent with different flavors and different attributes, or his attributes, and also different manifestations of his creativity. And upon those ring settings you have the wisdom that comes along, meaning the ring itself, the stone. Yeah. So this is how he terms the book. In the first chapter, which is about Adam, the universal man, he says that God wanted to show the abilities the potential of Adam, and that is how he started his creation. That God wanted Adam to represent everything that he has. All his names and attributes were now going to be carried by this prototype creation that is Adam. This is what this portion means. In a comprehensive being, that the potential in Adam was to be able to reflect all the divine names and attributes. And this is how God wanted to see Adam. Okay. Qualified with existence that will contain its universal order, to reveal to itself, through itself, its mystery, for the self-vision of being through itself is not like self-vision through something outside which acts like a mirror. Ibn Arabi uses many parables and many symbols and many similes. That's the way he writes. And since he was very creative, he uses here a simile of a mirror. That there's a mirror, and there's polishing of the mirror. If the mirror is not polished and is foggy, then you have to, first of all, make sure you clear the dust off it, and then you have to start polishing. Once you polish the mirror, then everything that is now in front of the mirror will be an image, until a time comes when you won't see the mirror, you'll see the image. Right? When you look into the mirror, you don't say, I'm looking at the mirror. You're looking into the mirror, but who do you see? You see yourself. Do you see the mirror? No. It's there in your subconscious. I'm looking into the mirror, but when you look into the mirror, you're seeing an image of yourself. So Ibn Arabi is saying that when God looked into the mirror of Adam, he saw himself. And this is the meaning of the hadith, which says God created himself in the image of, God created Adam in his own image. Right? That's what that means. Meaning that the divine wanted to show his love and compassion to the world, and in order to show that comprehensively and uniquely, he chose Adam to represent him as a mirror who would reflect all the divine names and attributes. And that. We'll go on. Yeah. This is the mirror which I spoke of. This vague molded shape without a spirit, that before the divine breathed into Adam his breath, his soul, and gave life to Adam, Adam was vague. It was without shape. But once he breathed into him, now his potential became apparent, and then it became actual, and then Adam was able to see the divine names and attributes, all of them, in himself, and so on. What I want to show, then you can talk about the vessel and all of that, which you can read there. Ibn Arabi, as I said, uses the Arabic language. He said one of the meanings of the word insan, in Arabic, insan is man. One of the meanings of the word insan in Arabic is the eye. The word insan actually means the eye in certain poetry, that the Arab poets use the word insan to mean the eye. So he says that insan, who is the eye of God, man who is the eye of God, again, as I said, he uses etymology in a very creative light to prove his ideals and also his philosophy and his theosophy. So he says that God sees through the eye of man, and that is insan, and this is how he justifies the whole idea that is about polishing your abilities. So the way you polish your abilities so that you can reflect God is obviously through worship, and it's through zikir, which it is did, and it is through contemplation and through meditation, and by being kind and being humane and all of the good deeds. They say, the Muslim theologians say, that all good deeds will help you polish your soul. Ibn Arabi, as I said, followed Imam Ghazali in that. So Imam Ghazali was a great advocate of polishing the heart. In many of his treatises, he just speaks about polishing the heart through dhikr and through what you heard Azim saying, that you have sacrifice and you have a struggle against the nafs, your soul, and you go through these masochistic exercises so that you polish your soul and you get rid of all the ambiguity and the vagueness that you have in your soul, so that you become polished and your heart becomes polished and so on. Ibn Arabi is using the same thing. It's the same idea. It's not different, but he's saying it in a different way. That as you travel as a salik, as someone who's trying to reach God at a higher level, you're going to continue and maintain the mundane chores of religion. It's very important. Nowhere does Ibn Arabi say, you must forsake religion. He says you must maintain the standards of religion, which Al-Ghazali also said. Maintain the standards of religion, you pray 5 times a day, you fast, all of that. But in your methodology, in your thinking, in your contemplation, and in your times of privacy, you must develop the ability to see God in you and see God in everything else outside of you. This is the purpose of the Theosophy of Ibn Arabi. So we see this, Ibn Arabi, may Allah be pleased with him, gave us a legacy as to how to understand how Muslims should worship God in such a way that they appropriate, first of all, their understanding of God correctly, and then they act and interact with society in consonance with their understanding of God. So he says that if you don't understand God properly, you won't worship him properly. And if you don't worship him properly, you won't behave properly. Then therefore you will not be a complete Muslim. Okay? That's the bottom line. Right? But obviously, as I said, his influence transcended, I think, everything. And all the way from North Africa to India, even China, where his thought is still being taught today in the Muslim world. And we owe our legacy of theosophy and theology to these great giants like Ghazali, like Junaid, like Ibn Arabi, and so on. Okay. Coming down to maybe a footnote, some of you may want to know where I come from. So I studied in a seminary called Deoband. That's a place, name of a place in India. The Deobandis are actually Chistis. In their dhikr practice, they are pure Chistis. Okay. Khaja, what was his name? Imdadullah. Haji Imdadullah was a great Chishti Sufi. And he had khanqahs everywhere in northern India. And he had so many followers and murids. Some of his followers were great scholars, like the followers who initiated the seminary in Deoband were his students and disciples. They were also Chishti, and they also engaged in the dhikr you just engaged in. Same exercise, nothing different. So what I'm saying is that people, unfortunately, may have, due to the media, certain ideas that Muslim theologians and Muslim lawyers and Muslim scholars are somewhat deprived of the mystical heritage and the mystical experience. That's not the case. My first order is the order of Chishti. My first sheikh gave me bay'ah in the Chishti order and took a pledge from me in the Chishti order. Then I developed into the Qadiriyya and then the Akbariyya, which is Ibn Arabi's order also. So we see that throughout the Muslim world today, there are still many, many scholars and Muslim practitioners who engage in Sufi practices. But they say that you must maintain the order of religion also so that you get the best of both worlds.